Right, so we're going to talk about lymphatics before we get into the circulatory system. So, what are lymphatics? Well, when you see lymphatics drawn out, they're these green things. There. Are they really green? No. But they're always drawn in green and they always look like this. Um, the smaller lymphatic vessels are really hard to find inside other blood vessels. The bigger ones, not difficult to find, but definitely not green. So, what does that mean? Well, you can think of the lymphatics as like a storm drain. So, I know it doesn't rain a lot, but when water accumulates in the streets, you got water running down the street, it's going to wash down into the drain. And then that's going to, of course, drain on to another place. And water's going to flow from the street down in. And you'll notice all this crap right there. Well, as the water runs down the street, it's going to wash oil and garbage and leaves and chemicals and stuff from your yard and crazy clowns that'll rip your kid's arm off into the storm drain. And yes, it does all float down there. Um, but the lymphatics, same principle, minus the clown. It drains the excess fluid from the interstitial space. Remember, the interstitial space is the space in between cells. So kind of I suppose a look ahead here. So we have arteries, and I'm going to branch into expertly drawn capillaries, venous side of capillaries, which is going to collect on the other side, back in the veins. Again, really drawn. I could have been an artist. Well, here's the thing. On the arterial side of this capillary bed, there's quite a bit of pressure pushing fluid into the space in between cells. On the venous side, osmotic pressure is going to kind of suck stuff back in, but not as much. That means that you're going to push out more fluid from the blood than you suck back in. That leaves fluid out here in the interstitial space. Well, that fluid's got to go somewhere. Enter lymphatics. Now, as that fluid leaves the circulation here, it's also going to be rushing past those cells, and it's going to wash past them, and it's going to pick up any cell garbage and pieces of cells and bacteria, crap, and microscopic clowns or whatever, and wash it into these lymphatic vessels. Here's a lymphatic vessel, and here you see them woven in between those capillaries. Now, the lymphatic system is a one-way system, which means it's always moving back toward the heart. It doesn't get another choice. It doesn't circulate like blood. So blood, you see your arrows here, right? Blood is circulating. Lymphatic is not circulating. Lymph is not circulating, and lymph is the term for the fluid in the lymphatic vessels. The lymph always moves back toward the heart. It's a one-way thing. So when fluid builds up out here in the interstitial space, it pushes this little valve open, and it goes into the lymphatic vessel. As fluid accumulates in here, it pushes back on that valve, but it can't go back out. It's a one-way trip. It can't escape that lymphatic vessel. Now, these little doors that open here, they open majorly. Like, it's not just like a tiny little hole for fluid. Like, it is a big sort of wide open door that's pushed open. And that means all that crap can get washed in. Cell debris, pathogens, even entire cells can get washed in the lymphatics. Closer view. So here's your little door and fluid builds up out here and pushes that open and then moves in. Well, the heart's not pumping lymph and lymph isn't circulating. How does it get back to the heart? Well, it's propelled by the pulsation of arteries. There are arteries that are next to these, and when those arteries pulsate, it shoves on the wall of this lymphatic vessel and sort of squeezes it so that the fluid goes back to the heart. In the bigger lymphatic vessels, there will be some smooth muscles to and continue that idea of sort of squeezing it back to the heart. Now, because we are washing this cell debris and bacterial cells and toxins and all sorts of garbage into the lymphatics, it's very likely that they can become infected. Lymphangitis is inflammation of the lymphatic pathway. And the most common cause of this is a bacterial infection, group A strep bacteria. And when it happens, you will actually be able to see the lymphatic pathway through the skin. It's going to be hot and painful. Here we see lymphangitis, and now you can see that lymphatic pathway, axillary pathway, popliteal pathway there. Because this is draining excess fluid, if it stops doing that, fluid accumulates in the peripheral or in the space. Accumulation of fluid in the interstitial space is edema, accumulation of fluid in the interstitial space. Now, there are many causes of edema. One can be high blood pressure, where there's so much pressure pushing out on the artery side, you couldn't possibly suck it all back in on the venous side, and even the lymphatics can't keep up with that. Right? Your streets may still flood, even though you have storm drains, because it just can't keep up with that water. You may get fluid building up outside the cells. The lymphatics just can't keep up. There are other diseases that cause fluid accumulation, and one of those is elephantiasis. Elephantiasis. Pronunciation is important here, and often you'll hear someone refer to this as elephantitis. Elephantitis literally means inflammation of an elephant, which you don't have in your body. So the correct pronunciation here is elephantiasis. And typically it's caused by a little parasitic worm. This guy is Wucheria bancrofti. It's a worm, it's carried by mosquitoes, and it will infect the lymphatic vessels and eventually accumulate in a large enough number to block them. When that happens, they can't drain, and the fluid accumulates in the interstitial space. It's so much fluid that the tissues are going to attempt to compensate for that fluid bulk. Here's sort of the stages of life here. Stupid mosquito bites you, a little larva goes in your skin, so it is in your skin, and then right, you got male worms and female worms, and they meet in your lymphatics, and one thing leads to another, worm romantic comedy, and they end up having more baby worms. They produce these microfilariae, they migrate into the lymph and into the bloodstream. There's a mosquito biting you again, ingesting that microfilariae, which we're not going to get into the parasitic life cycle here, but there you go. Now, these in the lymphatics will begin to block vessels. So we have edema, especially the lower extremities, most notable in the legs and in the scrotum. Like I said, as that fluid accumulates, the skin and the other tissues are going to try to compensate that bulk by becoming thicker. Scar tissue develops. Surgery may be necessary to treat it, although not always super successful in treating the underlying cause. An estimated 120 million people in more than 80 countries are affected by this disease, and it's one of the leading causes of permanent disability in the world. So that sucks. Good news, it is treatable to some degree. Now, obviously, you don't want to let it degree. That's going to require surgical intervention. I'm not sure what they would do or if it's salvageable. That being said, the World Health Organization, at the beginning of this year, reportedly was on track to eliminate this disease. How would you eliminate this? Well, as it turns out, that stupid little worm has a bacterial cell in its intestine that helps it stay alive. Without that bacterial cell, the worm dies. So, the World Health Organization has been prophylactically treating people with antibiotics, killing off the worm before or they've been on track now. Admittedly, they're going to be distracted at the moment. I'm not quite sure what our progress is there. But numbers here have been coming down, and the outlook's better than it's ever been. Now, inside the lymphatics, we've got lymphoid cells. Now, lymphocytes, I mean, word means lymph cell, and these are going to be there, obviously. These are white blood cells. Now left, we do find them in two major forms, T cells and B cells. More on this later. T cells and B cells are going to attack antigens. I mentioned this before, more on antigens later. And we'll talk about right now, just ignore this. Other cells in lymphatics, we have macrophages, again, from monocytes. These are going to actively attack antigens. They're dendritic cells, which grab on the stuff and help bring them back to lymph nodes. And then reticular cells, which sort of make this mesh, this network for the other cells. So here we see these reticular fibers, reticular cells, and then the other little cells attached to them. All right. So the lymphoid tissue is a great place for your immune system to hang out. Why? Because all this garbage is getting washed back in. And if you want to find a homicidal cloud, you go look in a storm drain. If you want to catch some bacteria, the lymphatics are a pretty good place to hang out because it's going to get washed back into that system. You have two major types of lymphatic tissue. Diffuse lymphatic tissue is what it sounds like. It's diffused throughout pretty much all the organs. Lymphatic follicles are solid, packed reticular cells, and they may cluster together to form larger organs. Lymphoma is a tumor of that lymphoid tissue. And you'll hear terms like Hodgkin's lymphoma and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. We won't get into the depths of lymphoma. There are different types. Some of them are more aggressive than others. The lymph nodes, big time important lymph organs of the body. These are filters. So along this pathway of drainage, these are filters. And you see like the little nodes. Some of them are palpable, cervical, axillary, and inguinal nodes are pretty close to the surface. But as this fluid is getting pushed through the lymphatic vessels, this filters all the junk out so that that junk doesn't go back into general circulation. So major function here, filtering lymph. And again, this is where all that garbage is getting washed. So if you want to figure out where stuff is, you name the lymphatics. And so that's a great place to pay attention to what's in the So lymph nodes, they look like that. I'm not going to get into details here. Notice there's a bunch of vessels coming in. Those are afferent. Now there's an important term for you, afferent. Afferent with an A means in. This is the direction going in. Efferent with an E means out. Now notice that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 afferent vessels, but only 2 efferent. That means that more is coming in than is going out. It takes longer to get out than it did to get in. That's great because that gives time for that fluid to get worked and filtered through this system, where we find these cells of the immune system and things that are going to grab on the stuff that doesn't belong. Here's another view of that lymph node. So like I said, it comes through the afferent, leaves through the efferent. Now, sometimes the lymph nodes lose. Sometimes the bacteria build up in there and they replicate, and you lose. The lymph node becomes inflamed as your immune system fights back, and that inflamed lymph node is called a bubo. That is the correct term. It sounds ridiculous, but that's what it is, the bubo. And here, over here, you see this etching. This is of the bubonic plague. Bubonic plague, more appropriately, the plague, killed about 25 million people in 14th century Europe, 1300. It's like a third of the human population. Here you can see those inflamed lymph nodes in the inguinal region. There are other things that can cause similar things, but the bubonic plague is the most well-known cause of the bubo. Sometimes it's called the Black Plague. You should realize that that term, Black Plague, does not refer to these necrotic areas. In fact, in medieval Europe, it would not have been referred to as the Black Plague. It was referred to as the Great Mortality, Great Pestilence, something like this. Black Plague was something that was slapped on many years later. And it wasn't to, again, refer to the symptoms, it was to refer to as it being a very dark time in medieval Europe. Now, at the time, they did not know what was causing this. You know, now it's a bacteria that's transmitted by flea. At the time, again, not quite sure what's going on. So when you see like the pictures of the medieval plague masks, the really bird-like looking things, people with like herbs that they would carry or flowers, trying to block the smell of death because so many people were dying. None of that would have been effective, or at least not against the bubonic form of the plague. There are several different forms of plague, all caused by the same bacteria. The bubonic form, the let's see, there's bubonic, there's pneumonic in the lungs, and then there's septicemic in the blood. The good news is that the bubonic form of this had the highest rate of survivability. For the pneumonic in the lungs and the septicemic form in the blood, survivability was nothing. It was fatal. For the bubonic form, maybe at the time like 1 in 10, maybe? That may be too much to remember. I do know that if today this does still exist and left untreated, it will kill you. About 66% of people die within 4 days, and I would guess the rest die shortly thereafter. This has to be treated. Now, we can treat this now. An antibiotic, it is a bacterial infection. But what happens is that bacteria, it resists being killed by your immune system. So those cells that would come along and eat it, it's cool with that. And instead of just, dying nicely, it grows inside the cells of your immune system. These macrophages in the lymph nodes and it kills them, and then you get more inflammation, and it becomes a positive feedback cycle. Eventually, the lymph nodes will take on fluid, they swell, they rupture, and that's going to cause internal hemorrhage, this poisoning. Now, this is if I remember, uh, stage makeup. It is rather accurate for what it looked like, because you see the lymph nodes in the axillary and the cervical region. If you're really interested in this whole idea of the bubonic plague, there is a video from the Great Courses. And a very interesting 27 lecture series on the Black Plague. So, I mean, if you're bored, good times, right? Black Plague. So, other lymphoid organs, the spleen, you've always wondered what that does. What does the spleen do? It's a big lymphatic organ. It's where lots of your immune system lives. It also takes out some old blood cells. There's the spleen, unpaired organ on the left side. So, breaking down red blood cells, storing platelets. I'm not worried about the structure of the spleen, really. That's what it looks like. There's a lot of blood here, and there's, accumulation out there as old blood cells are taken out. A direct hit to that spleen can rupture. And it used to be that if you did that, they would take your spleen out. That's called a splenectomy. And if you take the spleen out, the bone marrow, the liver will take over most of the functions of the spleen. It does, however, absolutely cripple your immune system. And what would have been irrelevant infections, life-threatening, without your spleen. However, today, we know now that most injury to the spleen will fix itself. And the rate of emergency splenectomy has decreased drastically, where it used to be in the 70%, now it's in the 30s, 40% of them actually removing. They're a lot more hesitant than they used to be. Thymus is a gland we don't talk a lot about. It's in the neck, right over the heart. It's because you don't have one now. It's atrophied in the adult. The thymus gland is different than the others. We're not going to get into the structure. There's the thymus gland. It's different than other lymphoid organs because it has one job, and that is in T cell maturation. In fact, the T4 T cells in the thymus. More on that later. The simplest of the lymphoid organs are the tonsils, and these form a ring around the pharynx. So we have palatine tonsils and lingual tonsils, laryngeal tonsils. So how does the tonsil work? All right, so um, I'm trained as an ecologist, specifically invertebrate ecology. I deal with bugs. Now, I hung out with other ecologists, super, super fun group of people. And we have to catch lots of things that are alive, animals. And here's how this works. So you're gonna catch an animal, whether it's me catching bugs or them catching mice or whatever. Let's draw. Alright, so here's the ground. What they do is you take and you dig a hole in, and then you take one of the gallon Home Depot buckets and you put it in that hole in the ground. Make sure it's level there. Now, animals will walk into it. I'm not even freaking kidding. Animals are stupid, and they will freaking walk into that bucket. And you're like, can they see the bucket? I don't even know. But I promise you, dig a hole in the ground, drop a bucket in it, and crap will just blindly walk into that bucket. You want to make it really effective, put a little line beside it, like flashing or a board beside it so there's a straight edge. Those stupid animals will walk up to that edge, see it, and then walk right along it, right into the bucket. And they fall in the bucket, and then they're screwed. Can't get out. We actually had to put, for inference, we had to put a liquid down at the bottom so that when they fell into it, they died. Otherwise, what I'd end up with was, instead of a bunch of spiders, there was one fat spider that ate all the other ones. So in ecology, this is called a pitfall trap. And the tonsil is the same principle. It is not fully encapsulated. It has what's called a tonsillar crypt. And junk gets caught in it. So stuff's going by and it just falls in. Because bacteria are also stupid. And now once it's there, macrophages and parts of your immune system come in and they eat it, they destroy it. Now, debris can get caught there. And actually, um, bigger particles can eventually cause calcification. We have what's called tonsillar stone, which, while I'm not going to show you pictures because it's super gross, yeah, Google that crap. Usually asymptomatic. Tonsillitis is when that bacteria is here and it wins. It infects the tonsil itself. Treatment for that used to be just straight up tonsillectomy. They're a lot more hesitant to remove the tonsils than they used to be. And that's decreased over time. Like in the 60s, like the only thing that you needed to have your tonsils out was tonsils. And by the time I was in the late 80s, it took recurrent upper respiratory infections before they removed my tonsils. And of 5 boys, I've had one of them with a tonsillectomy. Similar deal where he just had recurrent throat and respiratory infections. And the rest of them, while they've had tonsillitis, they leave the tonsils alone because they do serve an important function here in protecting the pharynx from infection. Now, there are other lymphoid follicles, these things called Peyer's patches in the small intestine and the appendix. They're helping prevent bacteria from getting through the intestine. There's those. These would be what we call mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. And they're protecting the digestive and the respiratory tract from foreign. All right, so there we go. So here's our thing for lymphatics. After this, the lecture that you should look at is immunity. Now, I'm not going to get into a lot of the minutia that's going to go with immunity. And I really didn't hear either. We're going to look at big picture lymphatic, big picture immunity. We can move on and get to circulation and the cardiovascular. So this is next. The next lecture you should look at is the immune system.